Keeping your players focused can be a little tricky sometimes, but it's not impossible. Let's talk about that today. Hey everybody, my name's Joe. Welcome to Tabletop Theory, where we talk about things like role-playing games, counseling, educational theory, and all kinds of other stuff that can help you enjoy the hobby of role-playing better or help you to learn how to become a better game master. Today, I wanted to talk about the idea of keeping your players focused at the table, because this is something I've actually seen come up every now and then on Reddit and on Twitter and on other places where I talk to people that are running games about how to actually keep the game going when you have players who are sort of checking out periodically. And oftentimes I feel like that's sort of a tough thing to do, because if your players aren't engaged when it's not their turn, it's likely that the other players are gonna stop paying attention whenever their turn ends. And yeah, it's okay if your players just take a back seat periodically, but when I think people talk about the players checking out, they're really talking about players just sticking on their phone or sticking on their computer or not really paying attention to what's going on. But there are a few ideas that can be helpful to game masters that can help you keep players focused at your table, or try to figure out why they're not actually focusing at your table. Because oftentimes, the reason they're not focusing may not be what you think. So, group expectations. These are important because right off the bat, I find that in a lot of cases, players are joining games because they may not fully understand the type of game that they're actually wanting to play. In some cases, this means that players want to play games that are very combat heavy or very role play heavy or very social interaction heavy, but the game that they've joined doesn't necessarily tick all those boxes. So it's important before the game begins that the game master and the player, or all the players at once, actually have a conversation about what type of game that they're actually going to be playing in. Oftentimes this isn't just up to the game master. This can be done collaboratively between the game master and the other players. Some important things that you might want to cover during that conversation can be things as simple as how long will the sessions be and how many of them will there be? Because sometimes what I've found is that players will sign up to play Dungeons and Dragons, but they didn't sign up to play 6-hour-long sessions. They might have expected the games to only really last for about 2 hours. Or the players might have signed up to play a game that lasted for maybe all summer, about 6 to 8 weeks, but instead it's been going on for about 12. I try to think about this in terms of a meeting at work or the length of class in a school. Because if you're going to be in a meeting or a class and you only expect that meeting or class to last for 90 minutes and it ends up going for 4.5 hours, it can be pretty tough to stay engaged for that entire time. So it is important to actually clarify that with your players. Talk to them, clarify how long your sessions are going to be and how many sessions you expect there to be just in this particular group of play. Now, it doesn't mean that these rules are going to be hard and fast all the time necessarily. It just means that it gives everyone a clear expectation of what's going to happen during the games. And of course, once you have those things established, it helps to actually do your best as a game master to try to stick to those established parameters. If you've agreed for 4-hour sessions every other week and you try to do 6-hour sessions every week, don't be surprised when people may not show up or they actually stay disengaged when they do show up. Using character names is actually something that I've found to be really, really helpful. And let me kind of explain what I mean by that. Whenever I sit down to begin a session with my players, I make a very intentional decision to not address them by their player names. And unless something is like really, really important that I talk to the player immediately, like, oh, hey, Ben, you're on fire. Because in a lot of cases, what happens is people get sort of disassociated from their characters when they're playing for those long sessions. One of the ways I've found to help players stay focused in session is to just address them by their character name. If Ben is playing a character named Buswhack, then Buswhack is how I'm going to address him. Using a character name can be really engaging for a player, even if they're just doing something mundane. If I look around the room and I say, Buswhack, what did you roll for initiative? As opposed to, Ben, what did you get for initiative? The difference is you're engaging the character and it's bringing the player along for the ride. Even if I'm doing something that's potentially complex, like asking a player how their character's feeling, I'm not going to be asking the player. I might say, how's Buswhack feeling about this? Not, hey Ben, how's Buswhack feeling about this? Keeping as much of the language focused on the character gives your players an idea that they are actually involved in this world and a part of the story as it's progressing. Because what's the point of actually naming a character if your GM never uses the character name. The other standard that this sets in the game is it tells the other players what the other characters are named, and whenever those types of inter-character interactions occur, they are much more likely to use those character names instead of just referring to each other by hey Ben, hey Madge, hey Tam. All of those different names are player names, but at the same time, if you try to address them as Buswhack, Childress, or Corsair, all of those different character names give the players the opportunity to really get a lot more involved in what's going on. So description, to me, is probably one of the most important things that can really draw players into a world. And when I say description, I don't mean that you have to prepare very long, drawn-out, immaculate and detailed descriptions of everything that's going on around you and everything that happens to your players. Far from it. When I'm talking about description, I'm talking about the frequency of description, not necessarily the length of description. As an example, in combat, you might have players that are shooting a bow. I might say, Buswhack, roll your attack. And then he'll roll his attack and he'll come up with a result and maybe he hits. At that point, I can say, all right, Buswhack, you hit. Does that end your turn? And then we can just sort of move along. Or you can take the opportunity to actually draw that information out a little bit and sort of set the scene about what's happening. If Buswhack rolls to attack and he hits, I might say something like, Buswhack draws his bow, knocks an arrow, and lets fly as it across the room, slams into the dragon, and it just sort of ruffles back as it wedges the arrow underneath one of its scales, turns to Buswhack and snarls. It takes a few more seconds, but at the same time, that level of description rewards Buswhack, the character, for the action that they've taken. And if Buswhack misses, for example, I might say something like, Buswhack knocks an arrow, draws back and fires, and it skitters off the top of the dragon's scales. Now, that's shorter, but it's still a description of the miss. And the thing about those small pieces of description is that it gives the players a chance to visualize the actions that their characters are taking in game. And in my experience, the more frequent that type of description, the more engaged your players will stay because they're hungry for that next little bit of description that involves maybe not only their character, but the world around them. So to me, that key element of player engagement relies pretty heavily on the utilization of just small chunks of description for maybe mundane actions, and then if you get to the really heroic stuff that you really want to sort of narrate how it goes down, like someone coming in off of a zip line to drop a vial of Greek fire on the top of a gelatinous ooze and then land in the hero pose, yeah, sure, that's really cool. It's also even cooler if you can establish that standard as a game master of those little chunks of description, that your players might actually start to pick up that sort of language and utilize it whenever they're describing their own actions. It comes down to that ubiquitous question that everybody likes to hear during combat: how do you want to do this? Whenever the player actually finishes off a combat against a particular creature, then the player gets to describe what their character does. And if you've been using those small chunks of description, I've found that my players are far more likely to stay engaged and express their own small descriptions about what their characters have achieved. The other wonderful thing about description is that if you do it frequently enough, you can also drop little small pieces of plot information into those descriptions as well. For example, if you describe the eye patch that the High Priestess is wearing whenever the players first meet this character, then later, when the players find that same eye patch in the middle of a dungeon, they might have some questions about, where's this eye patch from? Oh wait, I remember the High Priestess was wearing this eye patch. And it can sort of draw those players into that sort of question and answer about what's going on in their world, because if you've given those small chunks of description as sort of an off-the-cuff remark and your players were paying attention, it rewards them for keeping those little pieces of information in the backs of their minds. Alternatively, if you do provide those little chunks of information and your players miss them, it can give your players a clear sign, oh, maybe I missed that last time, I might need to pay better attention in the future. Or if not all of your players are paying attention and you have one player that might have taken really specific notes and they've notated the fact that there was an eye patch worn by the High Priestess that looks just like this, then the other players realize, oh, I missed something, and thankfully that other player caught it. I might need to pay attention, or I might need to make sure that all of the information that this other player is collecting actually lines up with what I think. And then what that does is it creates a conversation between the players about what's happening in game, thus generating more reason to pay attention in the game and stay focused. So teamwork is oftentimes sort of described by me as something that is an idea that you want to promote with your players. It's something that you want your players to really start to feel comfortable doing. If they can work together as a team, then they can achieve a more positive or beneficial outcome for their characters, right? I'm gonna say something that might confuse some people. I would recommend periodically splitting the party. Now, I know what you're thinking. Don't split the party. There's literal t-shirts out there that say don't split the party. But in this particular context, what can happen is if you have if you have one party split into two groups, that you have one group that's investigating one part of the dungeon and another group that is investigating another part of the dungeon, what you can do is actually drop little pieces of information that one group might learn that's relevant to the other party. Now, the players know that the other group has learned some piece of vital information, but those characters don't necessarily know that. For example, if you're in the middle of a dungeon and Group A finds a lever that they might need to throw, but they don't know what it does, they might throw it. And then Group B on the other side of the dungeon starts feeling that there's water coming up through the bottom of the dungeon and they're trying to react to it and figure it out. But those two groups are separated, so the characters don't necessarily have a way to interact with each other. So what you then have are players paying attention to what the other group is doing that they're not necessarily involved with, but they're still having stakes in what the other group is doing. That level of attentiveness remains high, even though they don't necessarily have any ability to affect what's going on the other side of the map. They still have that sort of tension and fear about what might happen if that other group does something that could endanger them even further. This same principle can apply to things like social interaction. If you have one group that knows something about an NPC that the other group might be about to go interact with because you've decided to split the group inside of a city setting, where you have one group that might need to go shopping and you have another group that might need to go talk to some kind of informant, you can have people learn that small chunk of information about that informant while they're shopping. Or on the other side, you can have people having that kind of conversation with an informant, but then they might learn some vital piece of information about a shop that the other group just happens to have walked into. And having those types of collaborative, sort of high stakes, fearful moments or sort of exciting moments can really lead to players definitely paying attention even when it's not their turn. But at the same time, you can throw those little chunks of description and information into those party split situations to keep everyone engaged. Splitting the party isn't necessarily a bad thing. There are productive ways to do it, and maybe some of those ideas could be helpful to you. I've been running RPGs for almost 30 years now, and the thing is, in that time, I've had some pretty great conversations with players that have come up with amazing ideas for how to stay engaged. And specifically, I had a player several years ago that had ADHD, and what they told me was that in order to sort of overcome those feelings of being anxious and sort of hyper and not really being able to stay focused, what they did was they, and I'm quoting here, did something that their character would do. And so what that meant for them is that when they were playing a wizard, they had a little notebook that they had purchased, and they transcribed the spells that their character could prepare into the notebook. And what they did was basically whenever it wasn't their turn, they would start transcribing those spells, and they would kind of go wild with colors and doodles and sort of decorating the notebook itself so that eventually it did look like a legit spell book. It was really, really cool. But what that player did is informed me about sort of an interesting way to help other players down the line that might have something like ADHD or just an abundance of energy or just couldn't really stay focused for a long period of time. So over the years, when I've recommended that to other players, I've recommended that they do something that their character would do during downtime. And what that did was allowed those players to stay sort of in the headspace of their characters, even though it wasn't their particular turn. Other examples of this would be something like, I had a player who was a bard who would pluck on their guitar periodically, and eventually they actually taught themselves how to play pretty well. Or I had a player who played a rogue, for example, and their character played with knives all the time. So at the risk of encouraging something that could be potentially destructive, I recommended that they go get themselves what's called a training balisong, which is basically like a fidget spinner. Hang on, I'll show you. So a training balisong basically looks like this. You might have seen it before. It looks like a butterfly knife because that's what it is, but there's no blade on it. It's completely blunt. So there's no way for anybody to really hurt themselves with this beyond anything like a fidget spinner. If you throw a fidget spinner at somebody, it's probably gonna hurt them. And if you throw this at somebody, it's probably gonna hurt them too. But the thing was, whenever their character didn't actually have anything to do, they would sit there and play with that. And it sort of added to the ambiance of their character, just like the player that was transcribing their spells into their notebook because their particular character was very fastidious about keeping detailed notes in-game. And just like the bard enjoyed playing their lute in-game, I had a player that enjoyed playing guitar. So if you have the feeling that you have players that might benefit from actually having some kind of real-life downtime activity, you might suggest that to them, or you might try to find a way to sort of combine those interests that the players and the characters would have in order to keep them in that same character headspace during downtime. The thing about players with ADHD is that they're not trying to be intentionally disruptive. They still want to play the game, they just have to express their energy in different ways. So if you have ADHD or you have players that have ADHD in your groups, just remember, it's okay to have those different types of interaction. And even if they're plucking away on a guitar, it doesn't mean that they're not paying attention. It just means that they're trying to engage in a different way. For me, before COVID, and periodically when I get the chance to play with my friends and my players that have been vaccinated, what I try to do as a game master is not spend the entire game session sitting behind a table or sitting behind a GM screen. I've talked about why I don't really like to use GM screens in the past, but I think for me, trying to keep my players engaged sometimes takes the form of actually getting up out of my chair and walking around, because what that does is it allows me to express the different sort of nonverbal communications that a different character might have in different situations. As an example, I can choose to change the gait of how I walk. I might choose to change the different postures that I have. I might choose to add some other little idiosyncrasies like stroking a beard or playing with glasses or messing around with a training balisong. All of those different sort of things, you can do some of them online over a webcam, but you can also do them much more effectively, in my opinion, in person at a gaming table or in a room with other players. Because if you're able to actually physically move yourself around the space, you're not only able to actually change the sort of postures and walking styles and all the little physical things about yourself, but you're actually physically moving around the room. And what that does is it helps your players to actually stay focused on you and keep track of where you're going and what you're doing. Because that sort of like attentive interaction that you might get with a player can really be a lot more effective if you can actually change the distance between you and the player. If you want to express that this is something coming from far away, then get on the other side of the room and start shouting, "Hey, this is something you probably want to know." Or if you have something like you want to tell a secret to a player, you can actually get a lot closer, although with consent. "Hey, this is something you probably ought to know." The thing is, that sort of physical motion keeps your players engaged because it adds to the unpredictability of the scene. If everybody knows where you're going to sit for the entire time of the session, then it's sort of a foregone conclusion that they're really not going to have to pay much attention if stuff starts moving around. But if you physically move within the space, you're using it to your advantage because that keeps the players on their toes, or at least it has for me. The other thing that's sort of important to keep in mind is that if you do have players that are not paying attention and they're not focusing in your game, and you've tried some of those things, you've tried utilizing those sort of communication strategies by using character names or offering them to do something like play a guitar, or you've moved around the space and they're still not focusing, the other thing that you always have the option to do is have a bit of an intentional check-in. That means that you can have those conversations with your players. You can have conversations about what's going on in the game. And the important thing about that conversation is to try not to approach it from something like a judgmental perspective. In my opinion, it's oftentimes a lot more effective to approach those kinds of conversations from something like a solution-focused perspective. This means that instead of really focusing on the problem, you can try to work on solutions. So try to avoid saying things like, "What am I doing wrong?" and instead try to use things like, "What can we do differently?" Because in that case, you're not only creating a conversation about a solution, you're creating a collaboration about solution. You're not just taking it on yourself as the game master to say, "What can I do differently?" It's, "What can we do differently. Because you're having a conversation with the player and the game master at the same time, and that's a collaborative process. The other thing to keep in mind is that this isn't just applicable to one-on-one player interaction. If you have just one player who's not necessarily paying attention, that you feel like they're not necessarily being engaged, then I would discourage you from having that sort of in-person conversation with them with the other players around, because that can cause people to feel uncomfortable. What I would encourage is that if you feel like you need to have this conversation with one of your players, do it separately. Do it before the session, do it after the session. Just make sure that if you do this one-on-one, you try to be sensitive to how this person might react if this conversation was in front of other people. However, you can also have this type of conversation regularly with your entire table. How are we doing as a group? How are you feeling about the way things are going? And just open it up to the table. It could be that all of the players might have similar opinions about ways that things could be improved, or they might have an opinion that you never even thought of. Now, if you end up with having that one player who's not necessarily feeling engaged, also not participating in that sort of group environment, that would be an indication that you can have a conversation with them. And it's not to say that you need to kick out players who don't necessarily want to play. It's an opportunity for you as a game master to try to find ways to not only help your players stay engaged, but maybe even improve your own style of game mastering. It could be that you might be doing something wrong that you didn't even realize, or you might be doing something that your players find incredibly obnoxious that they want to change and that you could be completely open to. I've been doing this for a really long time, and the thing is, I have learned a lot from asking my players what could be done differently than I have figured out on my own, because the players are the ones involved in the game with me, and the more I involve them in how I can improve, the better off things usually get. The last thing I'll say about players not staying engaged is try not to take it personally. It's tough to know everything that's going on in your players' lives. It's tough to say that you have a read on everything that they're doing, and that whenever they're with you for a game session, they need to completely separate everything else about their life and stay 100% focused on what they have in front of them. That's not necessarily a reasonable expectation, because people are very complex and they have a lot of things going on in their lives. And it could be that the weekly game session that they have playing D&D at your house is their one chance to escape from some pretty painful stuff. And it could be that those painful things that they're trying to deal with creep in and they stick in their mind and they can't stay focused because what's going on is tough. It could be that this game session is the only time they get a chance to take a break from that. So have a little bit of understanding, have some compassion for your players that might not necessarily be as engaged as you want them to be. And if you try to take that personally because you feel like it's your fault that they're not being engaged in what you're trying to tell them, then that creates a lot of undue stress on you when it really doesn't need to be that way. Everyone has the capability to become a great game master. When things start to get hard because your players aren't necessarily paying attention, it's really, really easy to try to say that it's your fault. But the important thing to remember is that if you have a conversation with the players that aren't as engaged as you want, you might actually find something out about them, and you might find a way to help them, or you might find a way to help yourself. The thing is, if you approach those types of constructive conversations in an open mind and in a solution-focused way, it gives you the opportunity to grow. Because I'll just say this right now, don't approach these conversations in a disciplinary way. If your players aren't engaged, don't approach them and say, "You're doing something wrong. What's wrong with you?" That's not a really productive way to approach almost any problem, especially when you're dealing with something that's a game like Dungeons and Dragons. And it's also really important to remember that if your players do point something out and that they give you an idea of how to improve, it doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It doesn't mean that you have done something wrong and that everything is irreparable. You have the opportunity to improve from player feedback, and that's important because if your players are telling you how they want you to improve, it means that they believe that you have the capability to do so. Unless you're being bigoted, sexist, or just otherwise abusive, chances are your players probably have your best interests in mind along with trying to have a better time in the game. So again, don't think that just because your players aren't engaged that you have done something wrong. Taking it personally can lead to burnout, and that's just a whole nother host of really painful stuff that you probably don't really want to deal with as a game master, because it's a game. And if you work together with your friends and your players, chances are you're going to have a lot more fun than if you try to tackle the issue all on your own. So thanks so much for watching. I appreciate you being here. This is something that was actually brought up to me by Old Buddy on Twitter. He wanted to know how I try to keep players engaged, and I had some conversations with some of my players, and they gave me some of these ideas for how I usually run games, and I talked to some of my other friends that have run games in the past. If you have any other ideas for how you like to keep your players engaged, you can leave them in the comments section here. You can follow me on Twitter at TabletopTheory1, or you can follow me on Instagram at the same name. I'm also going to be releasing these episodes on podcast form now, so they're going to be available wherever podcasts are listened to. You can find me on Spotify, Apple, and all other kinds of places, so keep those in mind, and if you really want to listen to these on the go, you can check those out there. If you want to help YouTube know what's going on, you can hit the subscribe button, you can hit the like button, you can tell your friends, and if you want to support the growth of this channel, you can head over to Buy Me a Coffee and support me monthly there by becoming a member for $5 a month, and that would help me grow this channel and to try to make more of these videos. So thank you so much for watching, and I appreciate you being here. So affirmations are something that can be very helpful to people that might feel like they have an area that they want to grow. Maybe you've had a conversation with a player and you feel like there's some good feedback that they've given you and you want to stay focused. The thing about an affirmation is that it gives you the opportunity to be positive with yourself. Being self-critical can oftentimes take the form of a voice that says, "You're not good enough," or "Why would you do something like that?" or "You're a terrible game master." Instead, an affirmation is an intentional method of trying to overcome that sort of negative self-talk by giving yourself reminders that you are a good person, you are a good game master, and you can improve. Sometimes it takes the form of writing something on a mirror that you see in the morning. Sometimes it takes the form of writing notes for yourself that you'll find later in the day, maybe in your wallet, maybe in your laptop, maybe in your car. And sometimes you don't even have to come up with the words for these yourself. You can find inspiration from books, song lyrics, poems, whatever you find to be helpful that you think would help you achieve the goal for yourself that you want. Those are affirmations that can help you to defeat some negative self-talk and stay positive and stay engaged with yourself in a way that helps you grow to achieve the goals that you want. If you find the idea helpful, I encourage you to give it a try. Thanks so much for watching. Take care, be kind, and have fun adventuring.